Anthem for Doomed Youth by Wilfred Owen was written in 1917 over the months of September and October, while the young poet was at Craiglockhart, a military psychiatric hospital in Edinburgh, where he was being treated for shell shock, or, as we now know it to be, PTSD. Although Owen had written poetry on a range of different subjects from the age of about 17, it was only during his stay at the hospital that he was encouraged to write poetry about his experiences of war, particularly those that were the subject of his dreams, as part of his rehabilitation. His first poem to be published appeared in the hospital magazine The Hydra, which Owen edited during his time there. It was also at Craiglockhart that Owen met and struck up a friendship with Siegfried Sassoon, an already established poet who had written angry poems satirising those in command of a war which he increasingly came to believe was fuelled by jingoism. Sassoon became Owen's mentor, and under his guidance, poems such as Anthem for Doomed Youth and Dulce et Decorum Est underwent many revisions. While the jaunty rhythms of Sassoon's poems drip with both rage and bitterness at those in charge of the progression of the war, Owen's classical sonnet, with its at times complex sound patterning, is quietly contemplative, his anger seemingly exhibiting itself more as a despair at the state of the human condition that allows such atrocities to take place. In an unfinished preface to his first collection of poems, Owen describes his work as not about heroes. English poetry is not yet fit to speak of them, nor is it about deeds or lands, nor anything about glory, honour, dominion, or power, except war. Above all, this book is not concerned with poetry. The subject of it is war, and the pity of war. The poetry is in the pity. This pity is not limited to the pain and anguish that he felt at the suffering he both experienced and witnessed, though. Owen saw this as a tragedy of universal pain, as he deplored the way in which we are compelled to repeatedly commit acts of violence and evil against ourselves. Owen was discharged from Craiglockhart and returned to active duty in France in July 1918. He was killed in action on 4th of November, exactly 1 week before the armistice that ended the war was signed. His mother received the telegram notifying her of his death on Armistice Day. He was 25 years old. In the poem, Owen juxtaposes the various customary sounds and then sights of an Anglican funeral service against those of the battlefield. The contrast between the formal, measured and sanitised church ritual back at home and the chaotic, cacophonous and at times apocalyptic action on the battlefield highlights the brutality of the deaths of these men, who were often little more than children, and communicates not only Owen's frustration and despair at what he saw as a totally inadequate and ill-fitting recognition of the futile sacrifice that these men were making, but also his rejection of religion, which he had first verbalised in 1915. The poem follows the structure of a Petrarchan sonnet. It has 14 lines divided into an octave, 8 lines, made up of 2 quatrains, and a sestet, 6 lines, with a bass metre of iambic pentameter, didum, 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 didum. Although Owen does employ metrical inversion at the beginning of lines 2 and 3, which is where the iambic pattern of an unstressed stressed syllable is reversed, so that you get dumdy, known as a trochee, instead of didum. Its rhyme scheme of A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, F, E, G, G conforms to the rhyming conventions neither of a Petrarchan nor of a Shakespearean sonnet. As well as varying some line lengths by making them hypercatalectic, Owen also employs enjambment and caesura in places to modulate the poem's pace and rhythm. Some lines are indented, i.e. lines 2 and 3 in the first quatrain, lines 6 and 8 in the second, and lines 10 and 12 in the sestet, which create a visual pause between lines. Sonnets usually have a volta, or turn between the octave and the sestet, where the focus of the poem switches, usually from the presentation of a problem or situation to a commentary on the problem or the provision of a solution. Owen instead uses the volta to switch his focus from the chaotic sounds of artillery on the battlefield to the haunting sights of pain and sorrow in the eyes of the dying soldiers and the grief suffered by those left at home. In Owen's final handwritten draft, he visually separates the octave from the sestet, effectively creating two stanzas. As well as through the layout, Owen marks the beginning of the sestet, as with the beginning of the octave, with a rhetorical question, which he proceeds to answer in the ensuing lines. In the octave, personification brings the various sounds of the battlefield to life, effectively transforming the guns, rifles and shells into the officiants at a funeral which, rather than being a quiet, sombre and dignified affair, becomes jarring, grotesque and terrifying. Owen uses complex sound patterning techniques throughout, such as alliteration, consonance and assonance, which not only create onomatopoeia to echo the sounds of the battlefield in the octave, but also create lyrical cohesion and euphony in the sestet. An examination of the title Anthem for Doomed Youth helps us to understand the poem's underlying message. The word anthem has a couple of meanings. Not only does it refer to a rousing song identified with a specific group of people, such as a national anthem, but it is also the name given to the musical setting of a religious text to be sung by a choir during a church service. There's a sense perhaps that Owen feels that the national anthem, a song which glorifies and promotes blind Christian allegiance to a flag, is not worthy of these men who have been betrayed by the very country they have served. He is instead perhaps offering an alternative secular anthem, which describes their sacrifice in all its brutality and which, in its shocking truthfulness, is a far more fitting tribute to them. The title, as with the poem itself, also underwent revision. Originally called Anthem for Dead Youth, it appears that Owen changed it under the guidance of Siegfried Sassoon, as it is his handwriting that appears on the draft. The change from dead to doomed reveals an implicit value judgment, suggesting as it does that these soldiers never stood a chance. Their deaths were a foregone conclusion even before they set foot on the battlefield. Rather than just recognising them for their sacrifice then, Owen is also levelling blame at those who sent them out to die in the first place. The phrase doomed youth is almost oxymoronic in that youth is synonymous with energy and hope for the future, while doomed conveys an inescapably negative outcome. The fact that they are youth rather than men draws attention to the wasted lives of those who would not grow old with their wives or see their children grow up. The poem begins with a rhetorical question. What passing bells for these who die as cattle? Passing bells are church bells that are rung after a death as a signal for prayers. Rather than a peal of bells like you get at weddings, a single and sometimes muffled bell tolls one note at several second intervals. Owen's reference to the dying soldiers as these rather than those is an indication of his first-hand experience of and emotional proximity to them. The simile, die as cattle, suggests that they are slaughtered in great numbers. There is no individuality in their deaths as they are treated like cannon fodder. As with livestock reared for slaughter, for Owen they have effectively been born and raised for one purpose and one purpose only. Note how this line and its rhyming line are both hypercatalectic, i.e. instead of the usual iambic 10-syllable line, these lines have an extra unstressed syllable at the end, so they read didum, 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 didum-dee. In line 3, stuttering should be read as stuttering in order to maintain the iambic rhythm. The way in which the stress therefore falls away at the end of these lines helps establish the poem's downbeat tone. Owen answers his rhetorical question with a short minor sentence, only the monstrous anger of the guns. Both its brevity and the metrical inversion of the trochaic only, emphasising his despair at the lack of consideration that the men receive. The guns to which he is referring in this line are not of the handheld variety, like revolvers and pistols, but are short naval cannons or howitzers, which came to be known by the nickname Big Bertha, and that could fire artillery shells up to 15 times per minute, i.e. about once every 4 seconds, which is similar to the time interval of a tolling bell. The personification of these guns with the phrase monstrous anger emphasises the hostile and brutal nature of the men's deaths. In lines 3 and 4, Owen moves on from funeral bells to orisons, which is another word for prayers. Only the stuttering rifles' rapid rattle can patter out their hasty orisons. Note the repetition of the trochaic only in the first foot. The adjective stuttering, which communicates the series of short, sharp sounds emitted by the enemy rifles, also alludes to a way of speaking which is harsh and discordant. And the phrasal verb patter out further evokes the repeated tapping sound like the patter of rain, while perhaps also hinting at a rapid and continuous way of speaking, which is superficial and lacking in care and attention. Note the complex sound patterning in these lines where he alliterates rifle's rapid rattle, the r sound being later picked up in the second syllable of orisons on the next line, the consonants of the t sound in stuttering, rattle and patter, and the assonance of rapid, rattle, can patter, to evoke a sound of quick gunfire, which is further enhanced by the enjambment of this line, as the reader is unable to pause. The second quatrain begins, "No mockeries now for them." A mockery, in the sense it is intended here, is an action which is ludicrously futile. With one word, Owen seems to reject the trappings or features of conventional religious funeral rites for these men as hopelessly and laughably inadequate, and that they fail to recognise the huge personal cost and suffering incurred, not only by the men themselves, but by those who love them. Note the caesura here, signalled by the semicolon, the brevity of this minor sentence enhancing his angry dismissal of them. He continues, "No prayers nor bells, nor any voice of mourning save the choirs." For a moment it seems that the passing of these men's souls may be accompanied after all by the sweet and innocent voices of choristers singing Ave Maria. But this idea is quickly dismissed as he elaborates in the next line, "the shrill demented choirs of wailing shells." In a grotesque development of the image, the angelic, high-pitched soprano voices of the choir boys are transformed into a shrill and demented wail, almost akin to that of a banshee, as the shells come hurtling down to the ground. The final line of this quatrain, and of the octave, while still focusing on sound, takes on a more subdued feel as it provides a bridge to the sestet as the poem begins to move homewards back across the English Channel, and bugles calling for them from sad shires. This is perhaps an allusion to the last post, a call in the army which is sounded on a solitary bugle to signal the end of the day's activities, but which is also played at military funerals and at Remembrance Day ceremonies and services. It is a call that cannot be answered, however. In the personified sad shires, Owen employs what is known as a transferred epithet, where an adjective, sad, here describing the emotions of the people back home, is transferred onto the shires, or the counties across England where the men first enlisted. The sibilance of sad shires enhances this sense of sorrow. The beginning of the sestet is marked by another rhetorical question. What candles may be held to speed them all? This refers to the candles held by choristers during the funeral service, the light from which it is felt eases or speeds the passage of the dead from this life to the next. They are not to be found in the hands of boys after all, but in their eyes shall shine the holy glimmers of goodbyes. Owen's implication here is clear, that these choir boys who epitomise all that is innocent and holy are unable to hold the candles because it is they who are dying on the killing fields of France and Belgium. Instead of the faintly shining, wavering light coming from a flame, the tears in their eyes shall instead shine the holy glimmers of goodbyes. Note the assonance of the long I sounds in these lines with eyes, shine and goodbyes, and the alliteration of glimmers and goodbyes, the euphony of which enhancing the much softer, quieter tone of this second section of the poem. In the next lines, Owen plays with the sounds and meanings of words in a series of visual metaphors to consider what shall adorn the men's coffins, and to remind his readers that the casualties of war are not just limited to the fallen soldiers, and that those left at home should be remembered too. The pallor of girls' brows shall be their pall, their flowers the tenderness of patient minds. A pall is the cloth that is draped over a coffin, and in military funerals in the UK, this is often a Union flag, which is then folded and presented to the deceased's loved ones. The word pallor refers to an unhealthy paleness, usually relating to the face, suggesting the toll that worry and grief are taking on the bereaved, such as the soldiers' young lovers, far away back at home, and which becomes a white pall or cloth over the coffin. The pararhyme of the first syllable of pallor with pall and the consonance of the l sound, which is also picked up at the end of the word shall in this line and in flowers in the next, builds on the softer tone which the poet has already established for this part of the poem. Owen now explores the different meanings of tenderness, which can refer to the type of physical softness and sweetness that one associates with the delicate petals of funeral flowers, such as lilies, but which can also refer to the abstract emotional gentleness and affection of those at home who, with patient minds, stoically accept their grief and suffering. Owen brings the poem to an end with another visual metaphor, and each slow dusk a drawing down of blinds. The way in which bereaved families back home during the First World War would close their window blinds to communicate that they were a house in mourning, for Owen becomes the way in which night falls as the light slowly drains away across the battlefield at the end of the day. Note how Owen develops the consonants of the d sounds, which he starts in the previous line with tenderness and minds, in the final line with the alliterating dusk and drawing down, which is then picked up again at the end of blinds. The heaviness of the d sound enhances the downward movement of both the light and the window blinds and effectively drops the final curtain on the poem itself. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comments section below and I'll do my best to answer them. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more videos on English language topics and exam techniques and English literature texts.